big news of the day yesterday, and honestly, historic news, the death of Rush Limbaugh. So for those of you who never listened to Rush, you missed out. Rush was the granddaddy not only of talk radio, but of all of the alternative media. Without Rush Limbaugh, there is no alternative media. You have to understand what Rush was and what he was not. So what he was not is what the media are calling him today. A bigot, a vicious, terrible person, saying the world is better off because he is dead. Right? This is stuff that you are seeing in mainstream media outlets. It's stuff that you're seeing certainly on Twitter, which allowed rot in hell to trend when Rush Limbaugh died, as well as rest in piss. You can tell that the left really didn't like this guy. Here's the thing. The reason they didn't like Rush is because they kept trying to cancel him and they kept failing. The reason they didn't like Rush is because Rush provided an alternative. Until there was Rush, there was a media monopoly in this country on the left. Rush was the first point of pushback to that. Now, there had been conservatives who'd been on mainstream television before. Milton Friedman's Free to Choose aired on PBS, and William F. Buckley's Firing Line was also on PBS. But that was basically conservatives existing at the sufferance of liberal overlords in the media. The reality is that at the very beginning, there were just three networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. All of them leaned to the left. Virtually every major newspaper in the United States leaned to the left. And when it came to radio, radio was basically a dead medium. Certainly the AM band was a dead medium. It was really hard to listen to. The quality was really staticky. It was a bad place for music, right? All of the music had migrated over to FM. So AM radio was basically dead. And the Fairness Doctrine ruled. The Fairness Doctrine was this unconstitutional, I think, doctrine that suggested that if you had a broadcast license, you had to be fair in your presentation of the issues, which was a completely subjective interpretation because there was no way that folks with broadcast licenses were being fair in their presentation of the issues. They certainly were not providing all sides of any particular issue. Well, in 1987, the FCC under Ronald Reagan got rid of the Fairness Doctrine. And in doing so, they opened the path to AM radio because they allowed people with broadcast licenses to stop worrying about government mastering them and start worrying about what the market wanted to hear. In 1989, Rush Limbaugh launches the Rush Limbaugh Show, and it immediately becomes a sensation. And it becomes a sensation because there's an entire side of the political aisle that for decades has had no daily outlet for the news. Remember, there's no major mainstream newspaper that was right-wing. There was no television state. Fox News did not exist. I mean, none of this infrastructure existed. And when it came to daily news, there was no internet. So that meant that all the news that you ever got was daily news from the left. And even those shows that I mentioned before, a special like Milton Friedman, that happened once in a blue moon. And William F. Buckley, that might happen once a week, but it certainly wasn't every day. It certainly wasn't a commentary on the narrative as it was being spun out by the left in real time. So Rush comes along, and Rush is maybe the most talented person ever to enter the radio medium. I think probably without question, he's the most talented person ever to enter the radio medium. He single-handedly makes the AM band a thing because suddenly here is a person who is funny. This is what drives the left absolutely up a wall, is the fact that Rush was a funny person. Right? Rush was entertaining, and Rush saw himself as an entertainer. He called himself a lovable little fuzzball. He talked about how he's going to fight the left with one half of his brain tied behind his back, talent on loan from God, and all this is all tongue-in-cheek kind of stuff. And Rush approached the issues with humor, and this made him entertaining and subversive, and the left could not handle it. And if you talk to any conservative born after 1960, Rush was a seminal figure in their life. People of my age range, we listened to Rush because my dad was listening to Rush in the car. And on the way to UCLA, when he was driving me to UCLA some days, it would be Rush Limbaugh on in the car. And then when I was driving myself in my 1986 Honda Civic with no air conditioner, it was listening to Rush on my way in the car. And Rush was defiant in his resistance of liberal narratives. Rush was willing to say things that were true, but that might not please the people on the left. And this gave a lot of people courage. It gave me courage when I was in class. It gave me weapons to argue my position when I was at UCLA. Now, the left today will tell you that Rush was a polarizing figure, super oppositional, super terrible. Here's the reality. The left had a monopoly. Anybody who breaks a monopoly is seen by the monopolists as defiant and oppositional. That's the way this works. Everybody on the right now who refuses to kowtow to the woke authoritarian left line is seen as oppositional and polarizing and defiant. It doesn't matter that people like me do the Sunday special every week, and many weeks it is people on the left. That does not matter. None of that really makes a difference. The idea is that anybody who speaks up against the left is the cause of the polarization because the left should have complete dominance. Rush was the first person to deny this. Rush was the first person to say, listen, I exist, you exist, I hear you and you hear me, and we can communicate with each other. You, the conservative living in the middle of the country, who's been completely overlooked by the establishment media, you have a voice and you have a place you can go to hear people who agree with you. And you have arguments that you can leverage in support of your viewpoint. This is why the left was so frightened of Rush Limbaugh, because Rush was entertaining, because Rush did have a big crowd. It's why the left decided they were going to go after him. I think it is fair to say that if it were not for Rush, there would not be this entire left-wing apparatus designed at destroying people in right-wing media, because there wouldn't be a right-wing media. Fox News would not exist without Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh was the test case. He was the canary in the coal mine for the suggestion that there was, in fact, a massive market for conservative content in the United States. Because, again, the methods of dissemination just didn't exist to that point. So Rush was a deeply important figure in the history of conservatism. He also had a gift for distilling down complex arguments to something more simple. And William F. Buckley was famously sesquipedalian, right? He would use words that nobody knew, right? He was extraordinarily literate, but this didn't exactly make him always the best expositor of conservative to the truck driver, to the guy who didn't go to college. Rush was the guy who talked to everyone. Rush never talked down to anyone. And listen, I'm a huge Buckley fan, but there's no question that Buckley's chief audience was college graduates. People who read National Review are not the same people who listen to talk radio. Rush was the person who brought conservatism to the common man, which is why you saw in 1994, after Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House, Rush was given an honorary congressional seat by members of the Republican Party in Congress. You know, Rush's willingness and ability to explain conservative viewpoints made him unique in the space and also made him the target of unique ire from the left. Very early on, the left identified him as a threat, and then they dedicated nearly everything in their arsenal to destroying him. A lot of the same stuff that you see today started with Rush. The attempts to deplatform, the attempts to go after his advertisers, all that started with Rush. The attempt to blame people on the right for violence with which they had nothing to do, that all started with Rush. I'm old enough to remember when the left tried to blame Rush for the Oklahoma City bombing. So Rush was just the first guy there. And not only the first guy there, the most talented guy there. And you can sense how important Rush was by the amount that the left hates him, despises him. I mean, after he died, again, the reaction from the left, which is sometimes muted depending on who dies, was absolutely unbridled. Absolutely unbridled. And to pretend, by the way, that this exists equally on both sides of the aisle is very silly. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, there weren't people on the right who were talking about what a terrible, evil person she was and the world is better off without her, because it wasn't true. But with the left, the idea is that Rush Limbaugh was the font head of all evil, especially because, of course, Donald Trump had just been elected president of the United States, and he'd been president of the United States, and Rush had been a big Trump supporter. But for those of us who listened to Rush for 30 years, long before Trump was ever even in the rearview mirror, we recognized that Rush's legacy was way more than that. It was giving people a voice, it was making people feel heard, and more importantly, it was beginning a mass movement in favor of conservatism that actually had alternative outlets. Daily Wire would not exist were it not for Rush Limbaugh. This podcast would not exist were it not for Rush Limbaugh. Certainly this radio show would not exist were it not for Rush Limbaugh. Rush built this, right? We're all sort of living in the house that Rush built. Rush Limbaugh's wife, Catherine, made an announcement on his show Wednesday morning. She said, losing a loved one is terribly difficult, even more so when that loved one is larger than life. Rush will forever be the greatest of all time. And that, of course, is true. Just speaking of his life, Rush Limbaugh got started as a morning talk show host in 1983 at Kansas City's KMBZ. He went to California's KFBK in Sacramento in 1986, and in 1988, he relocated to New York and signed his syndication deal for The Rush Limbaugh Show. His daily show on New York's WABC, aired on 56 networks, eventually grew into the most listened to radio program of all time. It reached more than 600 stations and an estimated audience of some 27 million listeners, according to Emily Zanotti over at Daily Wire. In 1993, Limbaugh was inducted as a member of the National Radio Hall of Fame. In many ways, he shaped the modern Republican Party. He was an early supporter of the Tea Parties in 2009 and of then presidential candidate Donald Trump in 2016, of course. Limbaugh said several years ago, we stood for the concepts that are in our Declaration of Independence, right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. We stood for that. We were the beacon for it. To this day, that is why the oppressed of the world still seek to come to this country. And you can, I mean, the reaction on the right is universal mourning. The editorial board of the Wall Street Journal says a familiar voice in American media and politics has gone quiet. Rush Limbaugh, the most listened to radio host in America for 30 years, died Wednesday at age 70. We recall how bracing the Rush Limbaugh Show was in its early days. For decades, the airways had been governed by the Fairness Doctrine, a federal regulation requiring stations to balance quote-unquote controversial claims with contrasting viewpoints. The rule gave incumbent candidates and mainstream news outlets a near monopoly on public discourse. Reagan scrapped the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. By the 1992 presidential campaign, the radio star's first name was known across the United States. He was invaluable to the conservative movement of the 90s. He would spend an hour explaining supply-side tax policy or making the case for deregulation. Millions of Americans had never heard a coherent argument against the welfare state or Roe versus Wade until they tuned in to Limbaugh's show. He played an enormous role in popularizing conservative ideas and policies. His critics called him a racist and about everything else, which was always unfair. His real offense was to gain millions of weekly listeners by mocking the left's pieties. He dissected environmental scare campaigns. He ridiculed the news media for finding epidemics of homelessness only during Republican administrations. In 1994, Bill Clinton called a St. Louis radio station from Air Force One to complain about Limbaugh's criticism, not for the last time blaming scrappy radio hosts for his own political woes. In recent years, with the rise of more acerbic competitors and a general souring of public discourse, Limbaugh took on a more exasperated tone, says the Wall Street Journal. He also moved to the Trumpian right on issues like trade, immigration, and foreign policy, but unlike others on the talk radio right, he kept a sense of humor and rarely let anger drown his fundamental optimism about the United States. His great strength was never to take himself too seriously. Limbaugh knew he was an entertainer, not an intellectual or politician, he said so many times. He was popular because he was superb at his craft and represented traditional American values that the dominant culture too often demeans. And that, of course, is exactly right. Now, naturally, the left reacted to his death by doing exactly what they do with people they don't like when those people are alive. They took everything that he ever said out of context. They found his worst comments and they strung them together to form the corpus of his life. This is what CNN did. So CNN, instead of paying tribute to one of the pioneers of an entire medium, and maybe the pioneer when it came to the establishment of an alternative media, of course CNN wouldn't like this because it breaks CNN's monopoly. Instead, they ran an entire montage of just Limbaugh's worst lowlights, right? Because to the left, that's what everybody is. You are just a companion. Imagine if your life, at your funeral, your life was just all of your worst moments strung together. Here's the thing about Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh was on air live 3 hours a day for 30 years. For 30 years. It is impossible to speak for 3 hours a day for 30 years and never say anything that you don't regret, right? That is just a fundamental reality of life. But for the left, it's the things that he said that offended people or the things that he said that he then apologized for. That is the compendium of what Rush Limbaugh stood for his listeners. In the same way that all of the worst things about Donald Trump, that's the stuff you embrace. Because the idea here is that Rush was popular because he was bad, right? That's the idea, is that if you agreed with Rush on fundamental principles, this also meant that you were in cahoots with the things that he regretted having said. And so CNN, upon his death, they don't run a sort of tribute to Rush as a human being. Instead, they decide that it's important that they run a montage of a Media Matters, essentially edited compendium of all of his heresies.
Fans, known as ditto heads, cheered his brazen style, while critics blasted him for racist, sexist, and other offensive speech. He accused actor Michael J. Fox of exaggerating his Parkinson's symptoms.
He is moving all around and shaking, and it's purely an act.
Women must decide their fate.
And he insulted a college student who advocated for access to birth control, a conservative media icon whose legacy will always symbolize division.
I mean, from Brian Stelter, Rush's legacy will always symbolize division. CNN preceded Rush. CNN is maybe the most divisive force in the American media right now because they pretend to be objective, and they clearly are not. But this is what they boil down all conservatism to. See, it's not about what he said about Sandra Fluck, and it's not about what he said about Michael J. Fox. I'm sure he regretted both of those. I think he apologized for both of those things, actually. What it is for the left is that if you are a conservative, you are all of the worst aspect of you. If you're conservative, then all they want you to remember is all of that stuff, right? You don't have the literally thousands of hours of Rush Limbaugh talking about deep and profound issues. You don't have any clips on CNN of Rush Limbaugh at the end of his life talking about how to die with dignity, which he did talk about on his show. Instead, what you get is that crap. Okay, this is what the left thinks of you. What the left thinks of you is that you are that. And they think Rush was that. Rush was not that. Rush was, by all accounts, one of the kindest people that people had met. Tammy Bruce, who was a former left-wing radio host and ended up becoming right-wing, has a beautiful tribute to him today. Eric Erickson, who was always right-wing, has a beautiful tribute to him today. I only had the pleasure of meeting Rush in person once and over the phone once. I spoke with him over the phone, actually twice. I spoke with him over the phone because I was in his Limbaugh letter a couple of times. Just an absolute gentleman, very kind, extraordinarily generous. When I met him in person, Rush was shockingly retiring. He was not the sort of bombastic figure that you hear on the air. Rush was somebody who has been described by Eric Erickson, I think correctly, as having a quiet soul. That's who Rush was. People talk about the fact that he would give these enormous tips, these $5,000, $10,000 tips at a dinner. There are people on both sides of the aisle who talk about his unflinching politeness when you would talk with him. And yet, all CNN can boil that down to is he was a bad person, right? That's what CNN is boiling it down to. And you get the same thing from the New York Times. So the New York Times ran this headline. This is the headline that is currently up at the New York Times website. Quote, Rush Limbaugh, who built talk radio into right-wing attack machine, dies. Mr. Limbaugh, 70, who helped transform the GOP, pushed talk radio to the right with misogynistic and racist language and conspiracy theories. That is the most dismissive, disgusting, and ridiculous headline that I have read in quite a while from the New York Times. That's saying a lot because they do this kind of crap regularly. Rush Limbaugh's legacy to millions of Americans is that he taught them about conservatism. His legacy to millions of Americans is that he was entertaining about politics and introduced them to politics. His legacy to millions of Americans is that he gave them a way to fight back. And the New York Times boils that down to he was a racist, misogynist, blah, 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 blah. That's what they boil it down to. By the way, I should just note some of the other New York Times obituaries that they've run for public figures. This was run just a few years ago. Mao Zedong died on this year in 1976. The Times said he began as an obscure peasant and died one of history's greatest revolutionary figures. Or maybe Fidel Castro. Here was their obit when Fidel Castro, you know, the brutal and repressive Cuban dictator, died. Here was their headline. Fidel Castro, Cuban revolutionary who defied U.S., dies at 90. How about Ayatollah Khomeini? You know, the radical anti-Semitic, genocidal anti-Jew dictator of Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini, 89, the unwavering Iranian spiritual leader. Or how about this for Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan dictator, a polarizing figure who led a movement. How about Yasser Arafat? You know, like one of the founders of Islamic terrorism. Yasser Arafat, father and leader of Palestinian nationalism, dies at 75. So just to get this straight, of all the people I just mentioned, Mao, Castro, Khomeini, Chavez, Yasser Arafat, it's Rush Limbaugh who deserves the most rage from the New York Times. Why? Because Rush threatened their monopoly. That's really what this is about in the end. And so the blue checks were celebrating last night because that's what they do, because it is amazing that the people who consider themselves the most virtuous are the ones who are crapping all over a man on the day he dies. So you get Charlotte Clymer, of course, tweeting out, Rush Limbaugh was a coward and white supremacist. White supremacist. He aggressively and cynically exploited divisions in our country by weaponizing hatred and bigotry for his own personal gain. He was in service to his own greed, prejudice, and hypocrisy, and that is how history will remember him. Just delightful. Delightful, these folks. Siobhan Thompson, R.I.P. Rush Limbaugh, died 69 years later than he shoulda. Beautiful stuff here from the left. Don't worry, it's Rush who is the polarizing figure you see. These people are all for unity. The execrable Cenk Uygur says, the idea that you say artificially nice things about people after they die is weird. I've never understood the logic of it. Rush Limbaugh was a terrible person while he was alive. He made a living by attacking the powerless. His death does not in any way change or redeem that. Says Cenk Uygur, who spends his days abusing travel staff at the airlines. Okay, this stuff is just, I'm sorry, it's just gross. There's no reason to even dwell on it because all it does is give attention to people who are desperately seeking it. But the point is broader, and that is the reason that the left hated Rush is because Rush was representative of the fact that there is dissent, because Rush did not back down, because Rush spoke clearly. Let's be perfectly obvious about this. The reason they hate Rush is the same reason they hate everybody who does not agree with them. Because I promise you, the reaction to Rush Limbaugh's death, it will be the exact same reaction if, God forbid, something would happen to Sean Hannity, or something would happen to Tucker Carlson, or something would happen to Megyn Kelly, or something would happen to Glenn Beck, or something would happen to Dennis Prager, or something would happen to Mark Levin, or something would happen to me. The reaction would be exactly the same. Exactly the same. It would just be a compendium of the quote-unquote worst things that we'd ever said, and then it would be, what a terrible person, we're glad they're dead. And the reason they feel that way is because Rush challenged the monopoly. Rush changed the paradigm. The left doesn't like that the paradigm changed. The left doesn't decry polarization because they hate polarization in and of itself. If they did, maybe they'd want to have discussions with people on the right occasionally, as opposed to trying to silence them. No, the left believes that Rush was polarizing because the left does not like the idea that there even is dissent. The left does not want there to be another side of the aisle. Everybody knows that they would treat any person on the right who is not serving as their unique tool at a particular time this way. If John McCain had passed away in 2008 while running against Barack Obama, you would have heard the exact same crap about John McCain. If Mitt Romney had passed away in 2012 while running against Barack Obama, you would have heard exactly the same thing. Because John McCain died after having sided with Democrats on healthcare and after having gone up against Trump, then he was a hero. Same thing with Mitt Romney right now. All that matters for the left is whether you're a tool for them. If you are not, you are an enemy. Rush was an enemy, and therefore he was to be destroyed. But he refused to be destroyed, and in that lies a bit of inspiration for all of us, I would hope. Facts don't care about your feelings, and it's a fact that The Ben Shapiro Show is the largest conservative podcast in the nation. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on all of our content.